Hello, welcome to the Nutmeg from the Evening Standard. I'm Dan Kilpatrick and I'm joined by our Chelsea reporter James Robson, Simon Collins and Jack Rosser to talk about the sacking of Frank Lampard, who was dismissed by Chelsea after 18 months in charge this morning. James, what's your reaction to the news? How long has this been in the pipeline? Are you surprised? Should Frank Lampard be surprised?
It's one of those strange ones because you look at Chelsea's form and you look at Chelsea's form as a club in terms of how they treat managers. There's no surprise to this whatsoever. In terms of the timing, in terms of this morning, that feels slightly surprising to me. Let's be serious. It's been one of those situations where on the back of every result, you've kind of thought, well, is this the last game? Is this the last game? But with two winnable games this week, having won against Luton yesterday, which I know is meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but this was a period where he could have started to build momentum, build confidence. But then you start to think, well, did Chelsea even want that? Because if you've made the decision already that it's time to move on, you don't want anything muddying the water. And suddenly, if they're on the back of a 3-game winning run, it just delays the inevitable, and that doesn't do anyone any favours.
You're right. It kind of points to the fact that this has been in the pipeline for a while. You'd think that after the Leicester game would have been a good time to do it because Chelsea had 3 home games in a row, as you say. The first one being yesterday's win over Luton, which of course is now Frank Lampard's last game in charge. I mean, what's been going on behind the scenes since that defeat to Leicester, which I think we can now kind of safely say was the trigger game. It wasn't to do with the Luton result. What have Chelsea been doing to lay the foundation for this dismissal? And when we should say Thomas Tuchel, the former Dortmund and PSG boss, looks like he's going to be coming in as replacement. So again, what have Chelsea been doing to prepare the way for the German to replace Lampard?
So yeah, that Leicester game, which was dire. To be fair, it wasn't the only dire game they've had recently. This run has been going on since they went to the top of the table by beating Leeds last month. Let's not forget that either. But that seems to have been the straw that broke the camel's back, if you like. And it's been a case of, yes, they knew he was going to go, as in the club knew the decision had been made. Roman had made the decision. But you don't just get rid of the manager when there wasn't really any need to. It's not a case of, right, let's get rid of him and just let anyone take over until we bring in a replacement. Chelsea are, despite how it may look sometimes on the outside, they are a very well-organised club. When they make these decisions, they know what they're doing. They know what they're planning for the future. And it's been a case of getting Tuchel in place, getting their ducks in a row, if you like. We don't know entirely what that means in terms of quarantine, because he's coming from another country, so who knows, he might have to go into quarantine. We don't know if he's here yet or if he's been here yet. Maybe that's been part of the getting the ducks in a row, but he was certainly identified some time ago as the man to take Lampard's place, and they've just been finalising that deal. It's still not finalised, but they're certainly very confident they're in a position to they will be in a position to confirm him, announce him in maybe the next day or so, even maybe in time for Wolves midweek.
You briefly mentioned Roman Abramovich there, who would have ultimately made this decision. And I think I'm right in saying this is the first time in all the many managerial sackings he's delivered over the years at Chelsea that he's gone on the record to kind of speak about his personal relationship with Lampard, to thank him for his time at the club, and to generally wish him well. I mean, why do you think Abramovich has chosen to do that for Frank and not for Ancelotti, Mourinho, Avram Grant, etc., etc.?
This is unprecedented, right? He hasn't done this before. He doesn't like talking about football matters in general. Generally, when he talks about football or Chelsea, let's say, it's to do with sort of off the pitch good work that they're doing. This is someone who didn't even particularly want to say much when it went to his 10-year anniversary of owning the club. He just doesn't particularly like to talk about football, but he's very, very ruthless in the background and absolutely on top of everything that goes on, which is why when it becomes his decision, once he makes the decision, it doesn't really matter what Marina is thinking or Bruce Book or anybody else. It's his decision, which is why it's probably come as a surprise to Lampard, because he was probably thinking, well, I'm getting a bit of time here, we can turn it around. But once that decision's made, it doesn't matter who else is there. His mate, Peter Cech's at the club, doesn't matter. Decision's made. But I think this is a signal, a sign that Abramovich appreciates just how unpopular a decision this is, because this is a bona fide legend of the club, and this is as close to sentiment as I can remember ever seeing from him since being in charge of Chelsea. It didn't count for anything because Lampard got the sack, but there is acknowledgement there of what a wonderful player he's been, what he's done. Let's remember, this is the person who sacked Chelsea's greatest ever manager twice. He sacked Carlo Ancelotti a year after he'd won the double. You know, he sacked Di Matteo after winning the Champions League. It was a matter of months after. You know, he doesn't do sentiment. But in terms of Frank Lampard, in terms of what he's done during that Abramovich era, I think he appreciates that needed to be acknowledged. But what I will also say is, from what I'm told, he has got no concerns about this being an unpopular decision. As far as he's concerned, pretty much since he's been at Chelsea, he has made unpopular decisions, and they've always proved to be right. So he's very confident it will be the same again.
Well, Jack, I was just about to come to you and ask if this is Abramovich's most ruthless decision, but James has just presented 3 or 4 reasons why it may well not be. But I mean, it does strike me that this is so cutthroat. I mean, we all know that the circumstances this season are unprecedented. They're unique. It feels like everyone's going to go through a bad spell because it's just so relentless. I mean, look at Liverpool at the moment. No one's questioning Jurgen Klopp, but you know, they can't seem to win or score for love nor money. And it feels like every top side is going to go through that dip at some point. Man City have already had it. Spurs are kind of just potentially coming out of it. And Chelsea are in it at the moment. Given that and given Lampard's history and connection with the club, does this feel like an overly ruthless call, do you think, by Roman Abramovich?
It's certainly quite a cold-hearted call, isn't it? You know, there are reasons, and some people are at pains to point out the reasons in terms of his record and points per game and things like that. And of course, no one's questioning Klopp, but he won the title last year. Lampard did admirably well, you know, settled a squad with so many young players, with so many mitigating factors, and got into the top 4. It is, like you said, every club's going to go through a bad spell, but not every club spent 220 million. And I think once Abramovich made the decision to spend that sort of money, whether that was the right decision to make or not, I guess we won't really know for another few years. But once he'd made the decision to spend that money, it was a clear statement of, right, you're not just closing the gap, you've got to challenge this title. And it felt like the sort of season where, with Liverpool and Man City having those runs, with everything being narrower, this was the prime season for Chelsea to go in and upset that duopoly at the top of the league for the last couple of years. But like he had the challenge to settle people last year, he's had to do it this year with bigger names, bigger price tags, bigger pressures and bigger expectations, which is where he's come unstuck, really. But like you said, everyone's going to go through this run of form, and given how tight it was, 2 wins over the next week could have put Chelsea right back in the mix, really.
I think you've also got to remember that normal rules don't apply when it comes to Chelsea. I think the first time we were talking about the pressures that Lampard was under, and he can still make the top 4, he's not this far off it. I said back then that that's not what Chelsea are about. They've never been a club, as long as Roman Abramovich has been there, that has been happy with top 4. This isn't, with the greatest respect, Arsenal. It isn't the modern day Manchester United. It's not about getting to the Champions League. It's about win the league, win the Champions League. And from my understanding, Lampard, it was made clear to him in the summer that it wasn't a case of top 4 is a minimum requirement. It was, you've got to close the gap at the top. And Chelsea's concern is they're not closing the gap at the top, they're getting further away, further and further. And they thought that the way this season's going, they were going to end up a long, long way off.
Yeah, as Jack said there, Jurgen Klopp, perhaps not a fair comparison, but there are a couple of, I think, interesting comparisons in the Premier League at the moment in Mikel Arteta and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. James, I'll come back to you on Ole in a moment, but Simon, do you see similarities between the job Lampard and Arteta have done at Chelsea and Arsenal respectively? Obviously, they competed in the FA Cup final last year. Arteta had a dreadful start to the season. That was Arsenal's poor spell, if you like, but seems to be gradually turning the corner, albeit they were dumped out of the FA Cup this weekend by Southampton. But does the example of Arteta perhaps suggest that Chelsea should have given Lampard more time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the comparison can be made simply because you, like Lampard, you've got a young manager being given an opportunity at a big club to try and establish themselves and grow. And I think the key difference is just the parameters and the situation around it. I think at Arsenal, it was understood, you know, when Arteta was appointed, that this was a long-term appointment. It was a project manager that was going to take time. I think they were also understanding at Arsenal that they've hired someone who is learning on the job in what has turned out to be the most difficult first year for, you know, any manager, with the pandemic and all things that impacted. So I think Arsenal were always prepared to give Arteta time, and they always publicly and privately, even during that really difficult spell, backed him to the hilt. And they said, look, no, we believe in this guy's vision and we can see day to day what we're doing. I think that the difference with Lampard is obviously that first season, he almost had a similar situation to what Arteta had, where the pressure was a bit off. It was about playing young players. You can't sign players so we can understand, and all the mitigation was given then. But as soon as it became this new season and he got the big spending, it became back to the normal way of life at Chelsea, where you don't hire a project manager if you're Chelsea. You don't hire someone who you say, look, we're bringing this guy in for 3-4 years because he's got a vision, we're going to build it. Chelsea's about success, and it's about instant success, and it's worked for them. So you can't really ever go at Abramovich because that style has worked. They've pulled it off. But I think the question you have to ask yourself is, was it really right to ever hire a manager like Frank Lampard if you're going to be looking for somebody who's going to do that? I don't think he really was the right fit. Maybe for that one season, he was a perfect fit. But after that, he doesn't really seem like the fit, a young manager who's trying to build a project, because that's just not what Chelsea do.
The one thing to add with Lampard, I think, as well, Simon's talking about whether you bring in a project manager or someone with a vision. It's quite hard, having watched Chelsea over the last season and a bit, to sort of ascertain what a Frank Lampard team looks like and plays like. He's really struggled to get a system in place that fits everyone in this year. He wants them to be high energy, but beyond that, you don't know whether they're going to try and play on the counter, dominate the ball, sit tight, play direct. It's all very confusing, and there's no real, sort of Frank Lampard profile of a team or a player. You look at the signings this summer, and maybe Ben Chilwell is the only one that you'd identify as that someone that Lampard was really going after. He wanted Declan Rice and didn't get him. It's quite hard to ascertain what he actually wants from a player or a team. Yeah,
I totally agree that Frank Lampard didn't seem like a great fit for a Chelsea side that were going to spend 250 million. And agree with you, Simon, that it's not particularly fair to compare Arsenal and Chelsea. They do feel like apples and oranges, but perhaps Manchester United and Chelsea is a fairer comparison. You're two clubs where big success is expected. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer constantly seemed on the verge of the sack. United stuck with him. They're now top of the league, just dumped Liverpool out of the FA Cup. That they seem to be going from strength to strength. I mean, same question for you, James, having covered United and Chelsea closely. Is Ole an example to Chelsea that Frank Lampard was a project worth persevering with?
Not necessarily. And I also don't think Chelsea would particularly be looking at Manchester United as their way forward. Why would they? They've been more successful than United in recent times. Again, much like with Arsenal, there are different parameters here. Where United are concerned, their minimum requirement for any manager is top 4 or to be in the Champions League. If you don't get in the Champions League, then you're probably going to get the sack. That is where the Glazers set their benchmark. Abramovich's benchmark has never been that. It's much higher. And that is the problem making these comparisons. Okay, he's a young manager and he's a legend of the club. They're the similarities with Solskjaer, if you like, but that he's working for a completely different club. And he knew that. I don't know what he's being told on a day-to-day basis, but any manager of Chelsea and any player who'd been at Chelsea as long as he was at Chelsea would know very well the way Roman Abramovich acts towards managers who don't win major trophies and actually basically don't win the title or the Champions League. He was given money to spend, yes, but those players were, he was involved, and he made a big point of that he was involved, but those were players that any manager would be happy to manage. Tuchel being an example, Kai Havertz, Timo Werner, they were wanted by Real Madrid and Barcelona and Manchester United. These are top players, Ziyech as well. Abramovich builds squads and he puts managers on top of them. If the managers don't work, he replaces them. That is the Chelsea project, the Chelsea system. Now Lampard did nice things bringing kids through, and hopefully that will save them a lot of money, they'll be thinking. But that was, again, in very specific circumstances when they couldn't buy any players. Going forward, that's not going to be the issue anymore. So if Mason Mount and Reece James end up being brilliant Chelsea players, that's great, and that's Lampard's legacy. But it wasn't what he was brought in to do.
And just to pick you up on that, when you said Frank knew as well as anyone what he was getting into, I saw a quote on Twitter earlier, which I think is genuine, about Frank commenting on AVB's sacking and saying, he knew what he was getting himself in for. The job was maybe too big for him. He was too young and too inexperienced, which feels like the situation here, arguably, albeit Lampard a club legend. Simon, what did you want to add on that?
I'm just going to add, I mean, I know we're going to talk about successor and where Chelsea go next, which obviously looks like the Tuchel route, but just from your point of view, Dan, I mean, a month ago, I know we were sort of talking about Arsenal and Arteta being under pressure, and the name we sort of talked about a lot was Pochettino being the number one manager on the market. Do you think, had he been, available, Pochettino, had Chelsea done this earlier, would he have been interested in that? Would he have been a right fit for Chelsea? I know he's probably someone who likes a bit more of a project, Poch, so maybe not on the face of it, but just what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've got to say, I am quite relieved Pochettino's not still out of work, because I know there are admirers of Pochettino in the Chelsea boardroom, and I think they would definitely have been interested had he still been a free agent. And I think the fact that he's gone to PSG shows that he's not entirely committed to projects where you bring through young players, which is obviously what he had at Spurs. So I think he would have been very tempted by the quality of that Chelsea squad, the fact that he could have stayed in London. And of course, unlike Arsenal and Barcelona, he's never kind of publicly ruled out managing Chelsea. That's not one that he would have to go back on his word over. So yeah, I'm sure had he been a free agent, that would have been something Chelsea would have been interested in, and he would have been interested in. But let's talk about the man who looks like he is going to get the job, Thomas Tuchel. Simon, to come back to you, I know you've covered a couple of games involving Tuchel and seen him kind of up close and personal. What kind of man are they getting? Forget the manager for a moment. Do you think his temperament will suit the Chelsea job? Because one of the biggest criticisms of him, I think, is that he's struggled to manage upwards. He's fallen out with boards at Dortmund and ultimately PSG, where he was sacked about a month ago. So coming to a club like Chelsea, where there's no shortage of kind of boardroom politics and power struggles left, right, and centre, has he got the temperament to come in and do that job, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the most interesting thing, I think, but certainly at Dortmund and PSG, where it did seem to go wrong was further up the chain than down the chain. Certainly the players seemed to buy into his methods at both clubs, certainly in the beginning, and then perhaps towards the end issues came about. But I think from the face of it and what we'll see in terms of the media and the fans, I think he's someone who'll certainly get people on side quite quickly. I remember sort of 3-4 years ago when he was over here with Dortmund playing against Spurs, and the British media sort of were wooed by him quite quickly. Certainly drew a good relationship with them, and then in 2018 they were out there at the same time, PSG as Arsenal in Singapore. And there are a few of us British media out there who obviously were first time meeting Emery. We all know about his difficulties with English, and Tuchel was coming in sort of straight afterwards, and we'd do press conference with both managers, and you'd spend sort of 20-25 minutes with Tuchel and you think, this guy's brilliant. He's a fantastic speaker. He's really charming. You really like him, and you were sort of hoping that Arsenal had hired him instead of Emery. But I think early on that will set the groundwork easier for him. I think he'll be able to get his message across to the players, to the media. But the question, I think, will be all about how he deals with, the powers that be, because particularly at PSG, from what you read from journalists based in Europe, that was where it all went wrong for him. And if there's any club where you don't want to get into a power struggle, it's Chelsea.
The task for him, I think, is really, really clear. Obviously, he's got to manage up and deal with those personalities. Marina, Petr Cech as well. It'd be interesting to see if he stays in the Chelsea squad beyond the end of January in the registration window. But the key task is clearly to get the best out of Havertz and Werner. The suggestions that, or maybe it looks like they've just gone for an available German manager to help get the best out of their two big signings, but that is what he will be tasked with. Not only success in terms of getting them back into the race for either the top four or the title, if that's still attainable, doing well in the Champions League, obviously reached the final with PSG last year, but the key to his success will be getting the best out of the players that Abramovich has gone out to spend so much money on.
James, is it as simple as Chelsea have two German players who cost a lot of money who are struggling, so let's hire a high-profile, out-of-work German manager? Because it does look a little bit like that from the outside.
It certainly looks like that, yeah. But also, let's be fair, this is a manager who any club looking for a manager, he would be at the top of your list. He's a fantastic manager. And he's on the back of having won back-to-back titles with PSG before getting the sack. So he leaves there with his reputation absolutely intact. I think you would just look at it and say, well, that's a bit of a crazy club. Well, he's joining another crazy club, if you like. But I suppose from his point of view, it's pretty clear what he needs to do. He's got a really, really good squad. I still look at that Chelsea squad and think, I can't see many that are better than that in the Premier League. It's really strong in every department. You got a top manager working those players, and you could do great things. And that's obviously what Abramovich has thought in the end. I've given Lampard this squad, and this has actually shown up his managerial deficiencies, if you like. Not my words. I'm saying that's probably what Abramovich is thinking. But obviously, those two players are the players they need to get to kick into gear. But from what I'm told, the problems that Chelsea were concerned about, it wasn't just those two players. That absolutely wasn't their concern. And to be fair to Lampard, he said himself just last week that he said Kai Havertz has been no trouble whatsoever, despite the fact he's been pretty awful form-wise. The problem at Chelsea, they feel, is that the entire squad was just devoid of confidence, and it was only going one way. And it's the old lesson in football, isn't it? That it's much easier to change a manager than the entire squad. And it's certainly the one that has brought Chelsea incredible success over the past 10 years plus.
James, was there any possible, solution for Chelsea to hire an interim manager who, takes over to the end of the season, or is it the fact at Chelsea that everyone is almost an interim manager, that it doesn't matter about the contract length? I'm just thinking whether it could have been easier then to go and get, a Nagelsmann or someone of an even bigger name than Tuchel if they just waited until that summer. Or do they think they can still get in the Champions League now? So you go and get someone like a Tuchel?
Well, for me, that the game that's always stood out over the hill has been that the Atletico Madrid game, and we've seen Abramovich do this before, sack managers midway through the season in the hope that he can still salvage it in the Champions League. So I think this is very much about trying to make this season work. It's not giving up on the season. If they've given up on the season, could let Lampard stay on, if you like. They believe there's still a lot to be had, and it is a bit of a crazy season. So top four is certainly not beyond them, and nor is the Champions League. In terms of whether they could have got a better, bigger name, I don't think there is much better out there than Tuchel. He's just come from PSG, getting them to the Champions League final, working with two of the best players in the world. That when it comes to credentials, he's got them all. He would have been a Chelsea target in any time, whether he was at PSG or not. Likewise, Max Allegri is available. It's not like there's a shortage of options for them to sign now. I suppose they might have gone for an interim, and obviously Rafa's become available now. If there was no one else out there. So you do just bide your time, but they didn't need to bide the time. They've got really good candidates out there to pick from now.
Would have been very funny if Chelsea had gone back to Rafa, given how much the fans disliked him. Just to end, James, what's next, do you think, for Frank Lampard? Because he's in a very peculiar position now in that he had his dream job at a very young age for a manager. It's only his second job. It feels like really the only way is down, obviously, from here in terms of his next role. Punditry, I'm sure, will be an option for him. Equally, I don't think his reputation is so tarnished that he couldn't get another fairly decent job. I mean, where do you see him going? What do you see him doing?
I think that's the fascinating question. You look at him and the immediate next step is down. It's got to be, obviously, from Chelsea. It's going to be down. But for me, this is now a test of just how serious he is about being a manager. He's mentioned a few times he could have gone into punditry. He could have just sat on the beach, if you like. He's a very rich man anyway. But he particularly wanted to be a manager. So this is the test. How much do you want to be a manager? Because the next job is going to be at a training ground that's a lot more grim than Cobham. It's going to be with players who are much worse than Kai Havertz and Timo Werner. So how much hunger and desire has he got to do that? He's also expecting another child. That could play into his thinking as well right now. Does he need this hassle? This will be a very chastening experience for him. But I would also say, in the grand scheme of things, he doesn't have a great body of work to build on. That's a bit of an issue in terms of his very next job. But his reputation isn't that bad. He did really well at Derby in 1 year. He did really well last year with Chelsea. This season isn't over, and he's still did really well in the Champions League. They could have still got top four, still in the FA Cup. If you look at it like that, it's not like he's walking away an absolute disaster. Compared to, for instance, AVB, when he got the boot, you wonder where on earth could he go? He ends up at Tottenham. So, maybe you should keep your eyes open.
Yeah, well, I do think sacking Lampard at this point, with enough ambiguity about his body of work and the fan base perhaps split, and given Roman's comments, which we discussed, it certainly opens the door for him to come back to Chelsea at some point in the future when he's a lot more experienced. I'm very much banging the Lampard for Celtic drum. I'd like to see him go and renew that rivalry with Steven Gerrard on a different kind of footing. But that remains to be seen. That's all we've got time for this week on The Nutmeg. Thanks very much for watching. Please do comment, like, share on social, or ask us any questions that we can get stuck into next week. But for now, thanks for watching. Goodbye.